Blood speckled the dust as Seth Harrington clenched his teeth against the pane, his hands a mess of shredded skin and exposed flesh from the barbed wire fence he just wrestled with to save a panicked calf. It was 1877 in the harsh Wyoming territory, and mercy came as rarely as the rain. The pain shot up his arms as he stumbled toward the small homestead on the horizon. His horse had bolted when a rattlesnake spooked it, leaving him to walk the 3 miles back with hands that felt like they'd been put through a meat grinder. Each step was agony, each heartbeat pulsing fresh blood from his wounds. The setting sun cast long shadows across the prairie as he approached the modest cabin. It wasn't his place. He worked as a ranch hand for the big Crossfire outfit 10 miles east, but he needed help before infection set in. Out here, a bad cut could kill a man as surely as any bullet. Seth had nearly reached the porch when the door swung open. A woman stood framed in the doorway, her honey-brown hair caught in the last golden rays of sunlight. For a moment, he forgot his pain. "Sweet mercy!" she gasped, rushing down the steps. "What happened to you, mister?" "Barbed wire," Seth managed through gritted teeth. "Sorry to trouble you, madam, but I could use some help if you're willing." Her eyes widened at the sight of his mangled hands. Without hesitation, she reached for her apron, a simple cotton thing with small blue flowers embroidered along the hem. "I'm Madeline Ross," she said, untying the apron. "Come inside before you bleed to death on my doorstep." Seth followed her into the small cabin. A single room with a stone fireplace, bed pushed against one wall, and a rough-hewn table where a half-prepared dinner waited. The space smelled of baking bread and coffee, homey scents that seemed to ease his pain slightly. "Seth Harrington," he replied, trying not to drip blood on her clean-swept floor. "I work for the Crossfire. My horse spooked at a snake, and I had to walk here." Madeline poured water from a kettle into a basin. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair. "Let me see those hands." Seth obeyed, wincing as she carefully spread his hands palm up on the table. In the lamplight, they looked even worse. Deep lacerations crisscrossed his palms and fingers where the barbed wire had torn into him. "What possessed you to grab hold of barbed wire with bare hands?" she asked, though her tone held no judgment. "Calf got tangled in it. Would have cut its throat thrashing around." Seth's voice was strained. "Didn't have time to think about gloves." Madeline's expression softened. "Hold still. This will hurt." She poured whiskey over his wounds. Seth bit down hard to keep from shouting, but couldn't prevent a groan from escaping. The burning sensation was like holding his hands in fire. "Sorry," she murmured, though they both knew it was necessary. With gentle efficiency, she cleaned his wounds with water and a cloth, then reached for her apron again. Using a small knife, she cut the apron into strips. "That's your good apron," Seth protested weakly. "And these are your good hands," she countered, beginning to wrap the strips around his right palm. "I can make another apron." Her touch was light but sure as she bound his wounds. Seth watched her face as she worked the frow of concentration between her brows, the slight purse of her lips. She was lovely, though not in the showy way of saloon girls. There was something honest in her features, a quiet strength that matched the homestead she apparently maintained alone. "Where's your husband?" Seth asked, then immediately wished he hadn't. It wasn't his business, and out here, a woman alone likely meant tragedy had struck. Madeline's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Never had one. This was my father's place. He died last winter, pneumonia. I've been running it since." Seth nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry about your hands. You'll need to rest them for at least a week." She tied off the last strip of apron. "You can't ride back to Crossfire like this." "I'll manage," Seth said, though they both knew it was foolishness to think he could handle a horse with his hands bandaged like mummies. Madeline stood, hands on hips. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we can send word to your boss that you're laid up." "I couldn't impose. It's not imposing if I'm offering," she said firmly. "Besides, a woman alone out here could use a bit of protection, even if the protector is somewhat damaged." A small smile softened her words. Seth knew she was right. His hands were useless. An infection could set in if he pushed himself. Still, staying in a single-room cabin with an unmarried woman wasn't exactly proper. "I'll sleep on the porch," he said. "Don't be ridiculous. It's April, and the nights are still cold. You take the floor by the fire. I'll take the bed." Her tone brooked no argument. "Now, can you eat with those bandages?" Seth looked doubtfully at his wrapped hands. "I might need some help." For the first time, Madeline laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small cabin. "Well, Mr. Harrington, I suppose I'll be feeding you like a child then." Seth felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with his injuries. "I'm not usually this helpless, Miss Ross." "I imagine not." She ladled stew into a bowl. "And it's Madeline. If I'm going to be feeding you by hand, we might as well use first names." She sat beside him, lifting a spoonful of stew to his lips. It was awkward at first, being fed like an infant, but Seth's hunger soon overcame his embarrassment. The stew was rich with vegetables and rabbit meat, far better than the usual fare at the ranch bunkhouse. "This is good," he said between bites. "Real good. Thank you." Madeline seemed pleased. Not many people to cook for these days. As she fed him, Seth learned her story. Her father had come west from Pennsylvania after her mother died, bringing 10-year-old Madeline with him. They'd built this homestead together, learned to raise cattle on a small scale, to grow enough in their garden to survive. She'd had 17 years of frontier education under her father's guidance before his death left her alone. "Weren't you scared? Being out here by yourself?" Seth asked as she offered him a piece of cornbread. Madeline considered this. "At first, yes. But fear doesn't feed the cattle or plant the corn. So I did what needed doing." "No thought of going back east? Surely you have family?" "My mother's sister is in Philadelphia. She wrote after father died, offering me a place." Madeline shrugged. "But this is my home. I know every inch of this land. I've watered it with my sweat and tears. How could I leave it?" Seth understood. The West had a way of getting into your blood, becoming part of you in ways that civilization back east never could. He'd come from Boston 5 years ago, a city boy seeking adventure. Now he couldn't imagine living anywhere without these vast open skies. After dinner, Madeline laid out blankets by the fire for him. The domesticity of it all, the meal, the conversation, the careful preparation of his bed struck Seth as something he'd been missing without knowing it. The bunkhouse had camaraderie but lacked this sense of home. "Thank you," he said as she checked his bandages one last time before retiring. "Not many would help a stranger the way you have." Madeline's smile was soft in the firelight. "Out here, strangers are just friends we haven't met properly yet." She touched his shoulder lightly. "Rest now. Morning comes early." Seth lay awake long after she had gone to bed, listening to her steady breathing across the room. His hands throbbed, but less painfully now. He thought of how she'd cut up her apron without hesitation, how her gentle hands had tended his wounds. It had been a long time since anyone had shown him such kindness. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster, and the smell of coffee brewing. Seth opened his eyes to find Madeline already dressed and cooking breakfast. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air around her. "How are your hands feeling?" she asked when she noticed he was awake. Seth flexed his fingers experimentally and winced. "Still painful, but better than yesterday. Let me change the bandages after breakfast. We need to keep the wounds clean." Eating was just as awkward as the night before, but somehow less embarrassing in the light of day. Seth found himself laughing as Madeline joked about his predicament, her eyes crinkling at the corners. After breakfast, she unwrapped his hands carefully. The cuts looked angry and red, but showed no signs of infection yet. She cleaned them again, more whiskey, more biting pain, and rewrapped them with strips torn from one of her old shifts. "I can't take all your clothes for bandages," Seth protested. Would you prefer I use nothing and let you get blood poisoning? Madeline retorted. Besides, I'm not exactly fashionable out here. No one to impress but the cattle. You impress me, Seth said before he could think better of it. A blush crept up Madeline's cheeks, but she didn't look away. Flattery won't get you out of resting those hands. Later that morning, a neighbor boy rode by on his way to town. Madeline sent a note to the Crossfire Ranch with him, explaining Seth's situation. By noon, the boy returned with a message Seth was to recover fully before returning to work. The ranch could spare him for a week or two. Looks like you're stuck with me, Seth told Madeline when she read him the note. Looks like it, she agreed, though she didn't seem displeased by the prospect. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Madeline would rise at dawn to handle the morning chores, feeding the chickens, milking her 2 cows, collecting eggs. Seth would follow her outside, feeling useless with his bandaged hands. By the 3rd day, he discovered he could at least carry small items tucked under his arms and began helping as much as possible. In the afternoons, when the spring sun warmed the earth, they would sit on the porch. Madeline would mend clothes or shell peas while Seth told stories of his travels, the mountains he'd crossed, the towns he'd visited, the characters he'd met along the way. You've seen so much, Madeline said one afternoon, her hands busy with needle and thread. Sometimes I wonder what lies beyond these hills. It's beautiful country, Seth acknowledged. But lonesome too. Towns full of strangers, most just passing through. No real connections. Is that why you stay at Crossfire? For connections? Seth considered this. Partly. The men there are good fellows, mostly. And I like working with the cattle. But it's not. He trailed off. Not home, Madeline finished for him. No, he agreed. Not home. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Seth felt his heart quicken. He'd known pretty women before, had even courted a few in various towns, but none had affected him the way Madeline did. It wasn't just her looks, though he found her more beautiful each day, but her spirit, her resilience, her quiet dignity. By the end of the first week, Seth's hands had begun to heal enough that he could use them for simple tasks. He insisted on helping more around the homestead, feeding the animals and carrying water from the well. Madeline protested at first but soon relented when she saw how much he needed to be useful. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Madeline asked him about his family. My parents are still in Boston, Seth told her. Father's a banker. Wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I was never one for ledgers and accounts. We haven't spoken since I left. That's a shame, Madeline said softly. Family is precious. What about you? Any siblings? She shook her head. Just me. Mother died having me. Father never remarried. Seth noticed how the firelight caught the golden strands in her hair. Without thinking, he reached out with his bandaged hand and tucked a loose strand behind her ear. Madeline went still, her eyes wide. I'm sorry, Seth said immediately, withdrawing his hand. That was forward of me. It's all right, she whispered. After a moment's hesitation, she added, I didn't mind. The tension in the room shifted, becoming something else entirely, something fragile and new. Seth wanted to say more, to tell her how much these days with her had meant to him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stood awkwardly. I should get some sleep. You've got me helping with the fence repairs tomorrow. Madeline nodded, her eyes still watching him with an unreadable expression. Good night, Seth. Good night, Madeline. The second week brought warmer weather and the first wildflowers of spring. Seth's hands continued to heal, the deeper cuts forming scabs while the smaller ones had already closed. He could now handle tools, albeit carefully, and had begun to make himself truly useful around the homestead. They repaired fences, mended the chicken coop, and cleared a space for Madeline's vegetable garden. Seth found himself thinking less and less about returning to Crossfire and more about the satisfaction of working this land, Madeline's land. One afternoon, As they worked side by side planting corn, Seth asked the question that had been on his mind. How do you manage all this alone? It's a lot for one person. Madeline wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of dirt. I hire help when I can afford it. Trade work with neighbors sometimes. But mostly, I just do what needs doing. And if you get sick? Or injured? She gave him a wry look. Like you did? I suppose I'd hope for a kind stranger to come along. Seriously, Madeline. It's dangerous out here for anyone alone, but especially a woman? She straightened, a flash of defiance in her eyes. I've faced down wolves at the chicken coop and turned away drunks at my door. I can shoot straight and ride fast. Being a woman doesn't make me helpless. I never said it did, Seth replied, admiring her spirit. But everyone needs help sometimes. Even me. He held up his healing hands as evidence. Madeline's expression softened. I know. It's just. People are always telling me I can't make it on my own. That I should sell the place, move to town, find a husband to take care of me. Is that what you want? She looked out across the rolling prairie, at the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the garden they were planting, the cabin her father had built. I want this. My home. My independence. After a pause, she added quietly. But sometimes I do wish I didn't have to do it all alone. Seth wanted to tell her she didn't have to be alone, that he could stay, that they could build something together. But it seemed too soon, too presumptuous. Instead, he changed the subject. Tell me about these corn seeds. Your father teach you about planting? Madeline's smile returned as she explained her father's method for ensuring a good crop. The moment passed, but Seth tucked her words away in his heart, a seed of its own kind. That night, a spring storm rolled in from the mountains. Thunder shook the small cabin, and rain pounded on the roof with such force that Seth wondered if it might leak. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, bright flashes. Madeline lit a lamp and set it on the table. Worst storm this spring, she commented, checking the windows to ensure they were securely closed. A particularly loud crash of thunder made her jump. Seth noticed she seemed more tense than usual. Not fond of storms? He asked gently. She gave him a sheepish smile. Never have been. Father used to tell me stories during bad ones, to distract me. I could tell you a story, Seth offered. Madeline looked at him gratefully. Would you? They sat at the table, the lamp between them casting a warm glow as the storm raged outside. Seth told her about his first cattle drive, a disastrous affair where he'd learned everything the hard way. He described falling off his horse into a river, getting lost in the dark, and being found by the trail boss who'd lectured him for an hour before showing him how to navigate by stars. Madeline laughed at his misadventures, her earlier tension easing. When he finished that story, he began another, and then another. The storm continued, but she no longer flinched at the thunder. Your turn, Seth said finally. Tell me a happy memory from this place. Madeline thought for a moment. When I was 14, Father and I built that corral out back. It was the first big project he let me help with completely, not just handing him tools. We worked for days in the summer heat, and when we finished, he said he couldn't have done it without me. Her eyes grew distant with the memory. That night, we sat on the porch and ate watermelon, watching the fireflies. He told me I was becoming a true rancher, just like him. He'd be proud of you, Seth said softly. Of what you've done here. I hope so. Her voice caught slightly. I miss him every day. Without thinking, Seth reached across the table and took her hand in his. His palm was still tender from the healing cuts, but he barely noticed the discomfort. He raised an extraordinary daughter. Madeline looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Seth. Something changed in her expression of vulnerability he hadn't seen before, mixed with something warmer. Seth, she began, but whatever she meant to say was interrupted by a tremendous crash of thunder, followed immediately by a splintering sound from outside. They both jumped up and rushed to the door. In the next lightning flash, they saw that a large branch had broken off the oak tree near the barn and crashed onto the roof of the structure. "The animals!" Madeline cried, already reaching for her coat. "You can't go out in this," Seth protested, but she was already pulling on boots. "Those animals are my livelihood. I have to make sure they're safe." Seth grabbed his own coat. "Then I'm coming with you." They dashed through the downpour to the barn. The branch had damaged one corner of the roof, but thankfully hadn't broken through completely. Inside, the horses and cows were agitated but unharmed. "We need to move them away from this side," Madeline shouted over the storm, "in case the roof gives way." Working together, they herded the animals to the far end of the barn. Seth's hands ached as he grasped lead ropes and pushed against stubborn cattle, but he ignored the pain. Water dripped through in several places where the branch had dislodged shingles. "We need to try to cover that from inside," Madeline said, pointing to the worst leak. "There's canvas in the storage room." They found the heavy canvas and, standing on the ladder, Seth managed to secure it across the damaged section of ceiling. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep the worst of the rain out until the storm passed. By the time they finished, they were both soaked through and shivering. Seth noticed Madeline's lips had taken on a bluish tint. "We need to get back to the cabin," he said, taking her elbow. "You're freezing." They ran back through the rain, which had finally begun to slacken. Inside the cabin, Seth immediately stoked the fire while Madeline changed behind a screen in the corner. She emerged in a dry nightgown and robe, her wet hair hanging in damp tendrils around her face. "Your turn," she said, handing him a blanket. "I don't have men's clothes, but you can wrap up in this while yours dry." Seth went behind the screen, stripped off his wet clothes, and wrapped the blanket around himself like a toga. It was hardly dignified, but better than catching pneumonia. When he came out, Madeline had made hot coffee. She handed him a cup, her fingers brushing his. The simple touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you for helping with the barn," she said. "Your hands, are they all right?" Seth flexed his fingers. A couple of the deeper cuts had reopened slightly, and were oozing blood. "They'll be fine." Madeline took his hands in hers, examining them in the lamplight. "Sit down. Let me wrap them again." She fetched clean cloth and the whiskey bottle. As she tended to his wounds once more, Seth watched her face, the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip as she worked on a particularly tender spot. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "You're beautiful," he replied simply. Her hands paused, and her eyes lifted to meet his. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither had put into words. "Seth," she began again, just as she had before the storm interrupted. But again, she didn't finish. This time, it was Seth who interrupted, leaning forward to press his lips gently against hers. For a heartbeat, she remained still, and he feared he'd overstepped. Then she responded, her hands coming up to cradle his face as she returned his kiss. When they parted, both were breathing rapidly. Seth rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for days." "What took you so long?" Madeline whispered, a smile in her voice. "I wasn't sure. I mean, I'm just a cowhand with nothing to offer but these torn-up hands." Madeline pulled back slightly to look at him. "These hands?" she said, gently lifting his bandaged hands. "These hands saved a calf from suffering. These hands helped repair my barn and plant my garden. These hands are worth more than any amount of money or property." Seth felt something tighten in his chest. "Madeline Ross, I think I'm falling in love with you." "Good," she replied, her eyes shining. "Because I think I've already fallen for you." The storm outside had quieted to a gentle rainfall, a soothing backdrop to the warmth of the cabin. They talked late into the night, sharing hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. Seth told her how he never felt at home anywhere until these 2 weeks with her. Madeline confessed her loneliness, how she'd maintained a brave face but cried herself to sleep many nights after her father died. "Stay," she said finally, as the fire burned low. Not just until your hands heal completely. Stay here with me. Seth's heart pounded. Are you sure? You value your independence. Independence doesn't have to mean being alone, she said, echoing his earlier thoughts. We could be partners, equals. Build something together. I'd have to talk to my boss at Crossfire. Give proper notice. Of course. Madeline touched his cheek. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just think about it. But Seth didn't need to think about it. He already knew his answer. I don't need time. This place. It feels right in a way nothing else ever has. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed everything clean. Seth woke on his pallet by the now cold fireplace to find Madeline already up and cooking breakfast. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching in her hair and surrounding her with a golden halo. Morning, she said, smiling when she saw he was awake. Sleep well? Better than I have in years, he replied truthfully. They ate breakfast together, making plans. Seth would ride to Crossfire later that day to speak with his boss. Madeline would prepare the vegetable garden for more planting. They'd assess the barn damage in full daylight and make repairs. We should also talk about our future, Seth said, suddenly serious. If I'm to stay here, we should do things properly. Madeline set down her coffee cup. Meaning? Meaning I'd like to court you officially, with the intention of marriage. Seth felt his cheeks warm. I know it's fast, but out here life doesn't always give us the luxury of time. Are you proposing, Seth Harrington? Madeline asked, a teasing note in her voice though her eyes were serious. Not yet. But I want you to know that's where my heart is headed. He reached across the table to take her hand. I want to do right by you. Her smile was like sunrise. Then court me, Cowboy. Though I warn you, I'm already quite smitten. They spent the morning checking the barn. The damage wasn't as bad as they'd feared in the darkness of the storm. The branch had crushed a section of roof, but the main beams remained intact. Seth figured he could repair it in a day or two with proper materials from town. Later, he borrowed Madeline's horse for the ride to Crossfire. His hands were healing well enough now that he could manage the reins, though he was careful not to grip too tightly. His boss, a gruff but fair man named Jim Halsey, listened to Seth's story with interest. So you're leaving us for a woman and a small spread? He summarized when Seth had finished. Yes, sir. I know it's sudden, but… Halsey waved away his explanation. No need to justify it, son. Found myself a wife in much the same way 30 years ago. Best decision I ever made. He stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. The Ross place, you say? Knew her father. Good man, honest. If his daughter's anything like him, you're a lucky fellow. She's better, Seth said with conviction. Halsey chuckled. Well, you can count on a wedding gift from Crossfire. And if you ever need work temporarily, there's always a place for you here. Seth thanked him, collected his few belongings from the bunkhouse, and bid farewell to his fellow cowhands. Most were supportive, though a few teased him about being lassoed by a pretty face. Seth didn't mind. He knew what he'd found with Madeline was rare and worth any amount of ribbing. On the ride back to Madeline's their homestead, Seth felt lighter than he had in years. The Wyoming landscape seemed more vibrant somehow, the rolling hills and distant mountains filled with promise rather than loneliness. He crested the final hill and saw the cabin below, smoke curling from the chimney. Madeline was in the garden, kneeling in the fresh earth. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, shaded her eyes against the sun, and then stood, waving. Seth waved back, his heart full to bursting. His hands, though still marked by healing cuts, no longer pained him. In fact, he was grateful for the barbed wire that had led him to this moment, to this woman, to this life. He urged the horse forward, heading home. When summer came to the Wyoming territory, it brought with it a wedding. The small church in the nearest town was filled with neighbors, Crossfire cowboys, and even Seth's parents, who had finally responded to his letters with tentative reconciliation. Madeline wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried wild flowers gathered that morning. Seth, in a new suit bought specially for the occasion, waited at the altar with hands that bore the faint scars of barbed wire, a permanent reminder of how fate had led him to love. As they exchanged vows, Seth thought of that first day, how Madeline had wrapped his torn hands in her apron without hesitation. How that simple act of kindness had been the beginning of everything. Later, as they danced under the stars on their homestead, surrounded by well-wishers, Seth pulled his bride close. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. Madeline looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the same contentment he felt in his soul. "More than I ever thought possible." The scars on Seth's hands would fade with time, but the love that had begun with those wounds would only grow stronger with each passing season, a love as enduring as the western landscape that had brought them together.